On the evening of June the 13th, 1898, 2 months into the Spanish-American War, a series of explosions rocked the Caribbean port of Santiago de Cuba, carving out large craters described as, quote, like the cellar of a country house. Yet while the blasts clearly came from some kind of projectile, Spanish forces defending the islands neither saw any muzzle flashes nor heard the distant rumble typically associated with a naval bombardment. Little did the Spanish know they'd been struck by a brand new American secret weapon, a bizarre ship which remains unique in the annals of naval warfare and helped usher in a new, more deadly generation of shipborne weaponry. This is the forgotten story of the USS Vesuvius, the US Navy's first and only dynamite cruiser. For over 1,000 years, the only explosive available to weapons designers was black gunpowder, a mixture of charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate or saltpeter thought to have been invented in China in the 9th century AD. But while gunpowder completely revolutionized warfare and human civilization as we know it, by the 19th century, its many limitations have become glaringly apparent. Now classified as a low explosive, black gunpowder does not detonate, or rather deflagrates or burns rapidly, meaning it must be confined in a closed container to be effective. However, there is a limit to the pressure that gunpowder can generate, limiting the range of a traditional cannon and the blast effect of explosive shells. Furthermore, gunpowder readily absorbs moisture from the atmosphere, quickly rendering it useless if not properly stored, produces large quantities of thick white smoke, and leaves behind a residue that can quickly foul the barrels of cannons and muskets. But all of this began to change in 1846 when chemists Ascanio Cabrera and Théophile Jules Pelouse at the University of Turin combined nitric and sulfuric acid with glycerine to produce the world's first true high explosive, an oily liquid called nitroglycerin. Unlike black gunpowder, nitroglycerin actually detonates, producing a supersonic blast wave and releasing considerably more energy by weight. This made it considerably more effective as a blasting agent for construction, demolition, and warfare. But there was a tiny problem. Nitroglycerin is extremely unstable and sensitive, capable of being set off by even the smallest of shocks. But while its discoverers vehemently opposed its use as a commercial explosive, nitroglycerin soon began being used in large-scale mining and construction projects like the building of the American Transcontinental Railroad. But just as Cabrera and Pelouse had feared, the powerful new substance proved horrifically dangerous to handle, resulting in the deaths of thousands of workers. It was also dangerous to manufacture, requiring nitroglycerin factories being built on hillsides to allow the final product to be conveyed without pumps and the ingredients to be mixed in water-cooled reaction vessels to prevent overheating and premature detonations. Workers at these factories were even made to sit on one-legged stools to prevent them from nodding off on the job. Yet accidents still happened with disturbing regularity. On September 3rd, 1864, an explosion at the Nobel nitroglycerin factory in Hellenborg, Sweden, led to the death of one of the facility's owners, Alfred Nobel. Nobel's older brother, Alfred, was so distraught that he vowed to find a means of taming nitroglycerin. After much experimentation, he discovered that mixing nitroglycerin with a type of diatomaceous earth called Kieselguhr desensitized or phlegmatized the explosive, creating a putty-like substance that was safe to handle as well as transport. However, it could now only be set off by the use of a blasting cap, which Nobel had conveniently already invented. The new explosive, which Nobel dubbed dynamite, revolutionized the construction, mining, and demolition industries, making Nobel a very wealthy man. But dynamite wasn't without its flaws. For example, when improperly stored, it tended to sweat nitroglycerin, becoming sensitive to shock and dangerous to handle. In response, in 1875, Nobel invented a new explosive called blasting gelatin, composed of nitroglycerin mixed with nitrocellulose or gun cotton wood pulp and potassium nitrate. Even more stable than dynamite and incapable of sweating, blasting gelatin or gelignite remains one of the cheapest, safest, and most versatile industrial explosives in common use. But while Nobel invented dynamite for the benefit of mankind, humans being humans, it was also inevitably used in warfare, leading critics to denounce Nobel as a merchant of death. Disturbed by these accusations, in 1895, Nobel used his vast fortune to establish a series of prizes, honoring those individuals who had made the greatest contributions to humanity in the fields of physics, chemistry, physiology and medicine, literature and peace. The Nobel Prizes are, of course, still awarded to this day, and for more on the fascinating story of Alfred Nobel and the wholly unexpected legacy of his greatest invention, please do check out our previous video, How the Invention of Dynamite Ultimately Gave Us Viagra. From the 1860s onward, dynamite, blasting gelatin, and gun cotton found widespread use in military weapons, being used in naval mines or torpedoes, demolition charges, and in the case of gun cotton as a propellant for heavy artillery. However, these early high explosives were still too sensitive to be packed into artillery shells and other projectiles, for the shock of being fired would cause said projectiles to prematurely detonate in the barrel, what is known in the field of artillery as having a very bad day. But in the 1880s, an ingenious US Army officer came up with an unorthodox solution to this problem. Enter Captain Edmund Louis Gray Zalinski. Born on December 13, 1849 in Kornik, Poland, Zalinski and his family emigrated to the United States in 1853, settling in Seneca Falls, New York. In 1863, at the age of 15, Zalinski dropped out of school and lied about his age to join the U.S. Army, serving as an aide-de-camp to Union General Nelson A. Miles. In 1865, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery Regiment in recognition of his bravery at the February 5th to 7th Battle of Hatcher's Run. After the American Civil War, Zalinski remained in the Army, joining the 1st United States Artillery and rising to the rank of captain. From 1867 to 1872, he was stationed at the Fort Jefferson military prison on the Dry Tortugas Islands in the Gulf of Mexico, whose prisoners included 4 conspirators in the 1865 assassination of President Lincoln. These were Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and Edwin Spangler. In 1867, Dr. Mudd was credited with saving the lives of many prisoners and guards during yellow fever outbreak, prompting Zalinski to petition President Andrew Jackson to have him pardoned and released. Thanks in large part to Zalinski's intervention, that pardon was eventually granted in 1869. In 1872, Zalinski joined the facility at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a professor of military science and began working on various inventions for the U.S. Armed Forces, including improved bayonets and entrenching tools and telescopic sights for the artillery. In 1884, he and Irish-American inventor John Philip Holland founded the Nautilus Submarine Boat Company in Bay Bridge, New York, to develop combat submarines for the U.S. Navy. Their first creation, known as the Zalinski boat, was completed in September 1885. However, the submarine was badly damaged on launch, and despite being repaired and completing a number of successful trials in New York Harbor, the vessel failed to impress the Navy, and Zalinski and Holland soon ran out of money, forcing them to shutter the venture in 1886. However, Holland would later go on to develop the Holland-class family of submarines, the first to be officially adopted by the U.S. Navy, Royal Navy, and Imperial Japanese Navy. And for more on the fascinating early history of these sneaky underwater weapons, please do check out our previous videos, Who Invented the Submarine, and the ludicrously dangerous submarine that somehow became the first sub to sink another ship in combat. But Zalinski's most well-known creation was the pneumatic dynamite torpedo gun, a long-barreled artillery piece that launched explosive-filled shells using compressed air or gunpowder or gun cotton propellants. This system produced a smoother, more gradual acceleration that prevented the explosives in the projectile from being prematurely triggered. The weapon's barrel was smooth and unrifled, firing dart-like, fin-stabilized projectiles, which, while commonly referred to as dynamite torpedoes, were actually filled with a stabler-blasting gelatin composition rather than traditional dynamite. At this point, it's important to note that the term torpedo had a different meaning in the late 19th century than it does today, a reference to the torpedo fish or electric ray, itself named after the Latin torpere, to be stiffened or paralyzed. Torpedoes originally referred to stationary explosive charges like mines. Indeed, U.S. Admiral David G. Farragut's immortal pronouncement, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," during the August 5, 1864 Battle of Mobile Bay, referred to what today we would call moored sea mines rather than self-propelled underwater missiles. The modern motor torpedo, as we would recognize it today, was developed in 1868 by English inventor Robert Whitehead, but it didn't enter widespread naval use until the 1890s. But while Zalinski is credited with perfecting and popularizing the pneumatic dynamite gun, he did not originate the concept. That honor belongs to inventor D.M. Medford of Toledo, Ohio, who demonstrated a 2-inch caliber prototype of his creation to U.S. military observers in 1884. In one demonstration, carried out at Fort Hamilton, New York, Medford's gun fired a solid 5-pound shell over a half-mile, or over 800 meters, and penetrated a 26-inch or 660mm thick concrete target. But while this gun failed to attract official interest, Zalinski immediately saw potential in the concept and soon formed the Pneumatic Dynamite Gun Company. The following year, he completed an 8-inch caliber prototype which could fire a 100-pound or 45-kilogram dynamite-filled projectile over 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers. In 1887, he demonstrated his invention before U.S. Navy observers at Fort Lafayette in New York. His explosive shells completely destroyed an anchored target ship. This time, the Navy expressed considerable interest in the weapon, seeing it as a highly versatile replacement both for conventional naval guns as well as motor torpedoes. After all, not only did its high explosive shells pack more powerful punch than older black powder shells, but even if the projectiles scored near misses, the underwater blast effect could still inflict considerable damage to an enemy warship. They were also nearly as accurate as traditional guns and operating at much lower pressures, generating negligible recoil, and they used much lighter barrels, allowing them to be fitted to smaller, faster ships. However, these advantages came with serious drawbacks. For example, Zalinski's guns had a maximum range far shorter than black powder cannons, on the order of a few kilometers. Worse still, supplying the guns with compressed air required the use of large, heavy, steam-powered compressors, meaning it could only be deployed in large fixed emplacements like coastal defense batteries. Nonetheless, in 1894, the first 3-gun battery of 15 pneumatic dynamite torpedo guns was installed at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. The following year, another battery was installed at Fort Winfield Scott in the Presidio of San Francisco, while in 1901, 2 more were emplaced at Fisher's Islands, New York, and Hilton Head, South Carolina. The Navy also showed great interest in arming warships with Zalinski's guns, and in 1886 they commissioned a unique experimental vessel, the USS Vesuvius. The third ship in US naval history to be named after the infamous Italian volcano, Vesuvius measured 75 meters long with a beam of 8 meters and a displacement of 945 metric tons. Powered by a pair of 2,183 horsepower triple expansion steam engines, she had a maximum speed of 21 knots or 39 kilometers per hour. While fairly conventional in overall design, Vesuvius featured a unique main armament of 3 15-inch or 38cm Zalinski pneumatic dynamite guns. Due to their enormous 17-meter cast-iron barrels, the guns could not be mounted in the conventional rotating barbette or turret, and were instead fixed in place, firing forward, protruding from the ship's deck at a 16-degree angle. Unable to be independently elevated or trained, the guns could only be aimed by steering the entire ship, while range was adjusted by varying the air pressure supplied to the barrels. The air was supplied by 2 steam-powered compressors and a large reservoir pressurized to 7 megapascals or 70 atmospheres. The guns fired dart-like projectiles measuring 2.1 meters long, fitted with stabilizing tail fins and filled with 250 kilograms of blasting gelatin. These warheads were in turn triggered by special electric fuses, which could be set to detonate on impact or underwater. In the latter mode, a salt plug dissolved until it brought the fuse in contact with seawater, completing an electrical circuit and setting off the detonator. 15 shells were carried for each gun for a total of 45 reloads. Yet, despite all this massive and complicated machinery, Vesuvius only had a firing range of a mile or 1.6 kilometers, though this could be increased to 4.57 kilometers by using smaller 91-kilogram shells. Even so, this was far less than the range of conventional naval guns of the era. Vesuvius was thus relegated to performing shore bombardment under the cover of darkness, taking advantage of the pneumatic gun's lack of sound and muzzle flash to avoid detection. USS Vesuvius was laid down in September 1887 in Philadelphia by William Cramp & Sons Ship and Engine Building Company and launched on April 28, 1888, sponsored and christened by Miss Eleanor Breckinridge. During shakedown cruises the following year, the ship demonstrated the impressively high reload speed of her guns, firing all 45 shells in a magazine in 16 minutes and 50 seconds. However, these exercises also revealed the major drawbacks of the Zalinski system, including the short range of the shells and the difficulty of aiming the fixed guns. Nonetheless, USS Vesuvius was commissioned into the U.S. Navy on June 3, 1890, and joined the Atlantic Fleet at Gardiner's Bay, New York, under the command of Lieutenant Seton Schroeder. Over the next 5 years, she participated in various fleet maneuvers, gunnery exercises, and show-the-flag operations until on April 25, 1895, she was temporarily decommissioned and sent back to the Philadelphia Naval Yard for major repairs. She was recommissioned on January 12, 1897, and sailed to Florida under Commander John E. Pillsbury. On April 21st of the following year, the United States declared war on Spain, triggering the creatively named Spanish-American War. Though the roots of the war lay in Cuba's struggle for independence from the Spanish Empire, United States involvement was ultimately triggered by the loss of the armored cruiser USS Maine, which exploded and sank in Havana Harbor under mysterious circumstances on February 15, 1898. The conflict, which lasted just under 8 months, resulted in Cuba gaining its independence and the United States gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In 1898, USS Vesuvius was assigned to the U.S. fleet enforcing the naval blockade of Cuba. For the duration of the war, she was assigned a variety of duties, including running messages between Cuba and Florida and carrying out 8 shore bombardment missions against the port of Santiago de Cuba. Due to their short range and poor accuracy, Vesuvius's shells failed to inflict any serious damage. However, they had a profound psychological impact on the Spanish defenders, with the Directory of American Fighting Ships noting that, quote, psychologically, Vesuvius's bombardment caused great anxiety among along the Spanish forces ashore for a devastating shells came in without warning, unaccompanied by the roar of gunfire usually associated with the bombardment. While unique in design, Vesuvius was not the only ship in history to be fitted with pneumatic dynamite guns. In 1893, a group of Brazilian naval officers launched a full-scale mutiny, the Revolta da Armada, against President Floriano Peixoto, who they accused of unconstitutionally holding on to power. Having lost most of its ships to the rebels, the Peixoto government turned to foreign nations, including a sympathetic United States, to scrape together a counterinsurgent navy. In 1893, they purchased the former Morgan Line's coastal passenger and cargo steamer SS El Cid and fitted her with a single 15-inch Zalinski dynamite gun, commissioning her into the Brazilian Navy as the auxiliary cruiser Niterói. Unlike on Vesuvius, Niterói's gun was mounted on an electrically driven open mounting capable of being trained over an arc of 300 degrees. Still, the weapon's combat performance was mixed, as a contemporary report from the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute reveals, quote, "A correspondent on board that vessel, writing under the date of March 15, 1894, says Captain Baker and the other officers speak in enthusiastic terms of the trial of the cruiser's famous dynamite gun. Just before entering the harbor on the day of the surrender of the rebel forces, a shell was fired at Pie Island in the bay, and all agree the explosion was fine." It was fortunate for the crew of the Niterói that the rebels on Pie Island surrendered after only one shot, for that shot wound up disabling the entire Zalinski gun. This failure was blamed on the gun's commander, who was accused of being a traitor and demoted. Following the end of the rebellion, Niterói's gun was removed and mounted in a coastal defense battery at Fortaleza de Santa Cruz de Barra in the city of Niterói, the unusual warship's namesake. Niterói served as an accommodation ship for students from the School for Apprentice Seamen in Rio de Janeiro until 1898, when she was purchased by the U.S. Navy and recommissioned as the auxiliary cruiser USS Buffalo. Two other Brazilian cruisers commissioned during the rebellion, Amazonas and Almirante Abreu, were also purchased and commissioned as the USS New Orleans and the USS Albany. USS Buffalo served with distinction until she was sold for scrap in 1927. In 1897, two 8.4-inch or 21-centimeter Zalinski pneumatic dynamite guns were mounted to what would become the U.S. Navy's first practical commissioned combat submarine, the Holland IV. As on Vesuvius, the guns were mounted at a fixed elevation, with one firing forward and the other aft, and could only be aimed by steering the entire submarine. But by the time the vessel was commissioned into the U.S. Navy as USS Holland in October 1900, the stern gun had been removed to make room for an improved engine exhaust assembly. Later experience would reveal that torpedoes, not guns, were the ideal primary weapons for submarines, though the vessels would retain small swivel-mounted deck guns for surface raiding, used through the end of the Second World War. The interwar years also saw extensive experimentation with large gun-armed submarine cruisers, like the British HMS M1 and the French Surcouf, but that's a fascinating subject for another video. As previously mentioned, aside from its short range, the primary drawback of the Zalinski pneumatic dynamite torpedo gun was the need for large, heavy steam compressors to supply the necessary compressed air, equipment which could weigh up to 200 tons. To allow high-explosive projectiles to be fired by ordinary troops in the field, in 1894, American inventors Dana Dudley and Winfield Scott Sims created a lightweight dynamite gun dubbed, creatively, the Dudley Sims. Mounted on an ordinary two-wheeled field gun carriage, the Dudley Sims gun measured 4.25 meters long and weighed 450 kilos. Like the Zalinski gun, it used compressed air to fire a 4.5 kilogram fin-stabilized projectile filled with 2.25 kilograms of blasting gelatin, but instead of a heavy steam compressor, the compressed air was generated by smokeless powder that drove a piston down a cylinder mounted under the barrel. American-supplied Dudley Sims guns were initially used by Cuban rebels fighting the Spanish, first seeing action on August 28, 1897, near the town of Victoria de las Tunas. As Major Frederick Funston, an American Army officer attached to the rebels, later reported, there was no little uneasiness as to what would happen when the uncanny weapon was fired, and there was not so much of a tendency to stand too close to it. When the lanyard was pulled, the gun gave what sounded like a long cough and jumped a little. After the United States officially entered the conflict, the U.S. Army purchased 16 Dudley Sims guns on an experimental basis and deployed them to Cuba, most notably the 1st Regiment of the U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, the legendary Rough Riders, led by future U.S. President and patron saint of manly men everywhere, Theodore Roosevelt. Though one gun was present at the unit's most famous engagement, the July 1st, 1898 Battle of San Juan Hill, its ammunition was misplaced and the weapon saw no action. However, the gun was used at the subsequent siege of Santiago de Cuba. Unlike Major Funston, however, Roosevelt was not impressed with the gun, noting that while it was much quieter than conventional artillery and delivered a larger explosive punch, it was inaccurate, short-ranged, and constantly breaking down. Quote, "It was used as like a mortar from behind the hill. It did not betray its presence, and those firing it suffered no loss. Every few shots it got out of order, and the Rough Rider machinists would spend an hour or two setting it right." The guns later saw service on the islands of Puerto Rico, where the 4th Ohio Volunteer Infantry's Dynamite Gun Detachment used them successfully against Spanish artillery entrenched around the town of Guayama. Indeed, the use of these guns is partially credited with the overwhelming success of this campaign, during which US forces suffered only 5 killed and 28 wounded. However, the Battle of Guayama would prove to be the last major engagement in the brief career of the dynamite gun, the technology soon being rendered obsolete by the development of more stable high explosives like picric acid and TNT, as well as smokeless powder, which eliminated the thick smoke and fouling of black powder while allowing much higher ranges to be achieved. By 1900, all the Dudley Sims guns had been retired, while by 1904, all the coastal dynamite gun batteries were dismantled. Following her service in Cuba, USS Vesuvius was sent to the Boston Naval Yard and once again temporarily decommissioned to undergo extensive modifications. Her unique dynamite gun armament was removed and replaced with 3 18-inch or 450mm and 1 21-inch or 520mm motor torpedo tubes. Recommissioned on June 21, 1905, she was assigned to the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, where she served as a torpedo test platform. There she remained for the next 8 years, participating in various experimental torpedo trials and serving as a floating radio station until, in May 1913, one of her torpedoes ran a circular course and punctured her hull. Quick action by her crew prevented her from sinking before she was successfully run aground on Prudence Island in Narragansett Bay. Once repaired, she continued to serve until 1921, when she was finally decommissioned. On April 21, 1922, the one-of-a-kind USS Vesuvius was sold to J. Lipsitz and Company of Chelsea, Massachusetts, and broken up for scrap. Edmund Zalinski, inventor of the dynamite gun, retired from the Army in 1894. However, in recognition of his contributions to the national defense, he was promoted to major on the retired list on April 23, 1904. He died of pneumonia in Rochester, New York, on March 11, 1909, at the age of 60. But while the dynamite gun and the USS Vesuvius proved to be technological dead ends and are today but minor footnotes in the development of naval artillery, they nonetheless represent an important transitory step between the old world of black powder and the new era of high explosives. It was a revolution in weapons technology that would help make the 20th century among the bloodiest in human history.